have been approached and appointed by the President of the General Assembly to be one of the co-chairs of the United Nations General Assembly's high-level panel on the Multi-Vulnerability Index, or MVI. I hope you know that Norway has a long-standing record of lending its support to multilateralism and to developing countries in general, and to vulnerable countries in particular, including the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. So even though I'm no longer in government, no the leader of our opposition, my country nevertheless is very pleased to have me, and I am indeed very honored personally to be able to assist and to contribute in facilitating the Assembly's request, and to work with my fellow co-chair and with the eminent of the members of the high-level panel that has been assembled to be finalized by 2022, a set of indices that measures the vulnerabilities of countries, including small island developing states. So, Excellencies, the need and call for the development of a globally accepted methodology or set of indices that adequately capture the special vulnerabilities of SIDS has been around since the adoption of the outcome document of the first Earth Summit in 1992. The work which the high-level panel has been mandated to implement is the culmination of over 3 decades of calls and efforts which over the years has been undertaken by a number of organizations and individuals in various forums. We know at a juncture where we have an opportunity to bring all these works together for your consideration. In his report, the UN Secretary General stated that the international community cannot continue to declare that the SIDS are a special case for sustainable development because of the particular vulnerabilities without, at the very least, addressing the long-standing call for the development of the MVI. He went further to state that for such a work could be carried out in a spirit of partnership and with a genuine desire and commitment to bring closure to this long-standing matter. The Secretary General further observed that in order to encourage and attract broader acceptance, the coordination of the work of the MVI has to be led and driven by member states. Such work should take place under the auspices of the General Assembly and be carried forward by a high-level expert panel supported by the Secretariat, headed by 2 eminent persons, one of whom from a SIDS, both appointed by the President of the General Assembly, tasked with finalizing the MVI in 2022. So, Excellencies, we have called for this first briefing session today because we want to ensure that this process is led and driven by you. We want to hear at the outset your views on the MVI. Your contributions, your reactions, your comments will assist the panel formulating the best set of recommendations that it has been mandated to present for your consideration later this year. We will have further briefing sessions, such as this, as the panel progresses its work. We will do so in order to ensure that the panel's work on the MVI is taking place in a spirit of partnership and with a genuine desire and commitment to bring closure to the long-standing matter. Distinguished delegates, let me now briefly highlight for your information some of the early work that the panel has undertaken so far since its inception. Before I do so, I wish to acknowledge the Secretariat, the ODESA, and the UNORLS for their support in this respect. To date, following a briefing by the Secretary to the co-chairs, the panel has had meeting 3 times on the MVI. This first meeting was an introductory session where the members of the panel introduced themselves to each other. This session also had a series of briefings from the Secretariat, including a historic overview and context on the MVI and the 2021 Secretary General report. The panel also heard a briefing on the possible development and uses of the MVI analysis and recommendations, and had the opportunity to discuss its proposed work program for 2022. At its second meeting, the panel had the opportunity to hear from authors of the latest work on the formulation of MVIs, The panel first heard a briefing on the Economic Vulnerability Index by the Secretariat of the Committee for Development Policy at UNDESA. The panel also heard a briefing on measuring and addressing SIDS vulnerabilities to accelerate SIDS SDG progress. Mrs. Simona Manescu, UN Resident Coordinator on Samoa Cook Islands, Neo Tokelau, presented the SDSN Multidimensional Vulnerability Index on behalf of the UN Resident Coordinators in SIDS. The panel also heard the briefing from the United Nations Development Programme, who represented the UNDP MYI, which was developed based on the Committee for Development Policies, EVI. The fourth and final briefing during the panel's second meeting was the Commonwealth Secretariat. I'm sorry, I had a flu before Easter. It still is lingering on. But the fourth and final briefing during the panel's second meeting was the Commonwealth Secretariat, who presented their work on the Universal Vulnerability Index. So, Excellencies, the third meeting of the panel was divided into two parts. First, it heard a briefing from the Caribbean Development Bank, who presented their latest MVI work entitled the Recovery Duration Adjuster. The second part of the meeting was dedicated to discussing key concepts such as multidimensionality and separability, which are important for defining the scope of the MVI and for its future possibility uses. You will hear more of this from my co-chair. The panel has also had a further opportunity to revisit the proposed work program for 2022 during this third meeting. I am pleased to note that with all matters considered, the panel will be holding 2 meetings per week going forward. Excellencies, this is a short summary of what the MVI's high-level panel has done so far. And since I'm just coughing, I'm now leaving the floor to Prime Minister Brown. Thank you.
Thank you very much, distinguished co-chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor to extend warm greetings from Antigua and Barbuda. I'm equally honored to have been appointed as co-chair of the expert panel by the President of the General Assembly. My fellow co-chair and I take this appointment seriously and commit to providing the General Assembly with the necessary updates as needed. So today, my co-chair and I, along with the other members of the expert panel, really want to hear from you to better understand your expectations for the MVI and what it should look like. What kind of information could or should be derived from it, and most importantly, to gauge your comfort levels for its use, especially for access to concessional financing, and I'll add here for SIDS in particular. As you heard from my co-chair, the panel is still in relatively early stages of its technical work. Only last Thursday, we began discussions on key concept definitions, and the scope and range of the MVI framework. These still need to be completed. Agreement on definitions and key concepts is the most logical place to start, as the MVI must be fit for purpose. We want to ensure that by the time we complete our work, that we would have developed an MVI that is not only fit for purpose, but one that is sustaining. The most important of these being to help vulnerable countries, in particular SIDS, as the most vulnerable, gain easier access to concessional financing for debt relief initiatives. In regard to key concepts and definitions, the panel has spent time reflecting on definitions of vulnerability and how best to broaden it to include the 3 dimensions of vulnerability, that is economic, environmental, and social, as per the mandate of the PGA. The latter dimension, social, is one which the panel recognizes that it must treat with cautiously, since adding a social dimension would then require consideration of factors to include exposure and past shocks, reflecting the economic vulnerability to social shocks. The panel has also begun to reflect on the types of shocks that should be considered in the MVI. For example, economic, social, and environment. The panel has been approaching this issue with caution to ensure the components of the MVI primarily capture inherent features or causes of vulnerability and not manifestations or effects. On the matter of a resilience component to the index, most vulnerability frameworks examined by the panel to date, for the most part, do not consider resilience systematically. The panel considers that resilience, that is the lack of capacity to cope with shocks, including the capacity to adapt, should be an important part of any framework as it introduces notions of finite support to development assistance for SIDS. That is, when sufficient resilience is built. Indeed, it is a well-known fact that resilience factors improve development, and they obviously shorten the recovery time, and they also ensure quick normalization after economic shocks or social or environmental shocks. I will point out here, however, that while the panel is considering resilience as part of the overall framework of the MVI, the intent here is not to produce a general index reflecting development or poverty, but one that specifically reflects the risk for a country to be harmed by exogenous shocks. Our challenge, however, would be to capture this in a coherent framework that is also simple and easy to understand. Resilience in itself is transversal and more difficult to link directly to other dimensions of vulnerability. Turning now to three other key criteria, which are particularly important for the use of this MVI for access to concessional financing, I now speak to the issues of separability, simplicity, and universality. On the issue of separability, this refers to the structural or exogenous aspect of the framework and is critical to the concept of vulnerability. It is essential if the indicator is to be used by donors to allocate concessional resources between countries, or even to give access to concessional financing, that is eligibility. Here there are alternative definitions of what structural means, which the panel is still to agree on. What is clear, however, is that factors directly reflecting the quality of current public policies are to be excluded. On universality, for the MVI to be credible and useful to SIDS, their vulnerability must be fairly compared to that of other vulnerable countries, albeit in different ways. In this regard, the panel will avoid as much as possible narrow concepts reflecting the specificity of SIDS, for example, tourism receipts over GDP, but rather look for common factors such as concentration of exports of goods and services. And we also believe too that, developing an MVI focusing on SIDS, SIDS being the most vulnerable among developing countries, that the index will be applicable practically to all developing countries. Similarly, this balance that we spoke to earlier will be clearly reflected in every dimension and will include issues such as sea level rise versus increasing aridity. Finally, on simplicity, as previously stated, the panel is keen to keep the overall framework as simple as possible. We want to make sure that we have an MVI that is functional. The MVI is not intended to reflect the precise vulnerability profile of each individual country or the vulnerability of a specific population to a specific hazard. There are other indices, tools, approaches, and methodologies that do this. Rather, it is intended to reflect the extent of countries' structural vulnerability in a clear and simple way to be of effective use. I should also state at this time that it'll be more than likely come down to one comparable number likely to be considered above or below a threshold value. In terms of uses, as stated previously, the panel will design a framework that is fit for certain specific uses, namely access to concessional finance and debt relief initiatives. There are a host of other potential uses, all of which were well articulated in last year's SG report on the MVI. But for any use of the MVI, we have to attract a consensus. Today, we want to hear from you and to understand what that MVI needs to look like in order to attract consensus and the types of political support necessary for its uptake and use. In particular, for access to concessional and grant resources, and certainly for bilateral assistance. So we want to hear what are your views and to hear your ideas, and more importantly, the boundaries which the panel must not cross. So we look forward to your constructive feedback. And I just want to, before I open the floor, share some information as to the parameters for intervention. So those who, or delegations wishing to speak, advised to use the chat function to request the floor. The request should be addressed to all panelists. And please type the name of your delegation and the title of the speaker and indicate what you, that you're requesting the floor. If we have a large number of requests, your requests may not be addressed immediately. However, the Secretariat will be monitoring the chat box to keep track of all requests, and you will be given the floor eventually. So I want to thank you in advance for your patience. And speakers will be given the floor in the order in which they inscribe in the chat box. And my fellow co-chair and I will announce 3 upcoming speakers at a time. Once given the floor, please turn on your microphone and begin to speak. Please also remember to turn off your microphone when you conclude your statement. Should you be unable to speak due to technical difficulties, you will be given the floor again after 3 or 4 speakers. Please note that the chat function is used exclusively for requesting the floor and for reporting technical issues such as connectivity difficulties. Substantive questions should be raised orally once given the floor. If you are experiencing internet connectivity and bandwidth issues, turning off your video may resolve the problem. In case your internet connection is interrupted, please go to the meeting invitation and rejoin the meeting in the Cisco WebEx application. Finally, in order to hear as many speakers as possible within the limited available time for this meeting, we would kindly request that delegations limit their interventions to a maximum of 3 minutes. Also, to have a truly dynamic discussion, speakers are asked to use talking points that encompass their key messages rather than reading long prepared texts. So without any further ado, we shall now hear the interventions from member states and observers. So I'm checking the chat box here to see if there's any hand up. I don't see any hand up as yet. Colleagues, you're free to intervene as appropriate.
I think Antigua and Barbuda, on behalf of the AOCs, has asked for the floor.
Oh, is it Ambassador Aubrey Webson? You're trying to intervene? Go right ahead, Ambassador. Excellency, your mic is off. Your mic is on, sorry. Can you
hear me now?
Turn on your mic. I'm hearing you now. Go right ahead. Yes, we're hearing you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Co-chairs, excellencies, good morning. I have the honor, excellencies, to deliver this intervention on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States. And we are particularly proud to welcome the co-chairs and particularly pleased that Prime Minister Brown, one of our own, is part of the team. We wish to congratulate the panel on their appointment, as it is the very first time that we're briefing you, and just to express our confidence in your work. Co-chairs, excellencies, the road to the journey of the development of a multi-vulnerability index has been a very long one, dating back more than 30 years. Over 30 years later, countless crises that we have seen that have directly impacted the environmental, economic, and health landscape of small island states. And we have seen the cascading effect of global unrest. All of these happening have brought us to where we are today. While we do not wish to revisit the past, international structures such as graduation that has hampered our ability to become resilient and build back better from multiple shocks, it is important to remind the expert panel here as to the exact reason why we are here today. There is an acceptance by all, and I repeat, by all, that SIDS have a very special circumstances and are uniquely vulnerable. Our small islands and with small economies make us inherently susceptible to external economic and financial shocks. Our geographies mean that climate change threatens our very survival. It is important to note, colleagues, that at any one point, a disaster can change the face of our small states, eliminating decades of developmental gains and at the extreme, render us landless. And yet, colleagues, another reminder that 30 years ago, in Rio, the international community recognized SIDS as a special case for sustainable development and acknowledged that we are the most vulnerable group of countries. But 3 decades later, we still do not have the necessary financial instruments, tools, development assistance in order to address the severity and multiplicity of the crisis we face. Co-chairs, Excellencies, we welcome your engagement with us today, and we note your intense work program and very tight timeline as you outlined. We also recognize the magnitude of your work and wish to emphasize the need to be meticulous. This, colleagues, is the only opportunity that we are getting to make this right. Therefore, we look forward to your continuous update to member states and your recommendations that will include in the Secretary General's report. Your recommendations, colleagues, and the report of the Secretary General are critical components to the international negotiations that will lend itself and be possible for the adoption of this MVI. Co-chairs, from the onset, AOSIS has been very clear on the process in the establishment of an MVI and the expected results. Since this is our first time engaging directly with you, we wish to provide you with some pointers as you undertake your work. 1, the MVI must offer a lasting solution to SIDS and must ensure that the vulnerabilities of our small states are taken fully into account and fully addressed. 2, the MVI must lead to the availability of concessional financing for all SIDS, in particular for those that were arbitrarily graduated into what is defined as middle and high income status. 3, the MVI must provide access to development, climate, and other financing. 4, the MVI must provide a platform to address the unsustainable debt levels of SIDS by considering debt relief, debt forgiveness, debt restructuring, and the innovative financing in debt instruments such as long-lasting solutions can be found. Without a comprehensive view of debt sustainability in the context of the MVI, SIDS would be unable to achieve the full implementation of the remaining years of the Samoa Pathway, the 2030 Agenda, and to achieve the SDGs. Our fifth point here is, while we have indicated that the 3 pillars of the sustainable development must be considered in the development of indicators, it is clear to us from our perspective and also from various studies, commission, and reports produced that the environmental and economic pillars warrant special attention to capture the structural vulnerabilities of small island states. A further point, a key component in the development of indicators must also feature the issue of resiliency. For us, the concept of resilient is twofold. A, the very reason why we are here today, colleagues, our very unique vulnerabilities. 2, it is not our desire to be dependent on a system or developed partners perpetually, not at all. The MVI for us must eventually lead us to a place where we are able to build our resilience. The MVI must also be agreed within the context of an intergovernmental process and must be accepted and taken on board by the entire United Nations system, developed partners, international financial institutions, and all of the private sectors with whom we deal. Finally, co-chairs and excellencies, AOSIS recognizes the potential and the universal nature of the MVI and welcomes the discussions on universality and its applicability to other developing countries as outlined by the Secretary General. We also wish to restate, as we have done before, that currently we do not see the MVI as replacing the established mechanisms such as the GNI. We see the MVI as complementing and addressing gaps in those mechanisms. The group looks forward to further engagement with the expert panel and other opportunities to address and speak to you. Again, we thank you and we wish you well in your work going forward.
Thank you very much, Excellency Aubrey Webson. I now acknowledge the distinguished delegate from Colombia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. Good morning to you and good morning to all excellencies and colleagues. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the like-minded group of countries, supporter of middle-income countries, composed by Armenia, Belarus, Chile, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Jamaica, Lebanon, Mexico, Morocco, Namibia, Panama, Peru, the Philippines, and my own country, Colombia. Allow me to express that we welcome the realization of this briefing, considering the paramount importance of the work conducted by the high-level expert panel. And we take the opportunity to congratulate the experts for their designation and to recognize the importance of having representatives from countries from different developing and development backgrounds. The group would like to highlight that the potential of the MBI is significant. We are convinced that its development and the conclusions of the panel will be pivotal to enable a more comprehensive understanding to measure the complexities of sustainable development, as well as to contribute to a more useful, efficient, and effective allocation of global financial flows in a manner that is beneficial for all developing countries, noting the current progress being made on the MBI for small island development states to address the multidimensional challenges to achieve the SDGs. The development of the MBI is timely, with the urgent need to use measures of progress that go beyond GDP to access concessional finance, a call that has been highlighted by the Secretary General in his report, Our Common Agenda. This initiative is also in line with the SDG target 17.19 of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Vulnerability should be considered as criteria to inform access to ODA, debt risk assessments, and resilience to current and future shocks. This is critical considering that indicators based on per capita income do not properly reflect context-tailored development needs and priorities. In the case of middle-income countries, we still need substantive support in finding solutions to strained health and education systems, high levels of indebtedness, large influx of refugees and displaced persons, dependence on imports of food and essential medicines, food insecurity, inclusion of immigrants workers in the COVID-19 response efforts, and eligibility for humanitarian assistance, funds and recovery programs from the COVID-19 pandemic. We therefore encourage the international community to capitalize the process and the outcomes of the high-level expert panel to improve, from an overall perspective, the provision of support for development, embedding the impact of current and future crises in bilateral and multilateral cooperation dynamics. Therefore, the group would like to take the opportunity to ask the following questions to the experts, also recognizing, Mr. Co-Chair, that you have addressed some of these issues. And the first will be how the potential use of the MBI to inform concessional finance and debt risk assessments is being considered. Second, how the MBI could enable developing countries to better reflect their needs going beyond GDP and countries' categorizations. And third, how is the MBI integrating current global crises, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and the COVID-19 pandemic? And therefore, how could it measure resilience to future shocks and crises? In my national capacity, allow me to express Colombia's appreciation for the approach shared by the co-chairs to tackle discussions. We do support an MBI that is complementary to current indicators, and we do believe it's going to be a key tool to address the particular needs of SIDS. We also believe that the MBI should be functional to identify and measure vulnerabilities in the three dimensions of sustainable development, recognizing an universal approach, and that developing countries might need support and access to concessional finance to face specific challenges, and considering national context to avoid significant regressions in their development gains. I thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair.
To cut off from something. What's happening?
PM Brown, your mic is off.
Sorry, I've been talking, my mic was on, my apologies. So saying before I acknowledge New Zealand, let me just alert the co-chair that she will announce the next 3 interventions. And just to react briefly to the intervention by Colombia, let me thank Colombia for his presentation. We would ensure that the final product, the MVI, is certainly universal in its application, and obviously to take resilience into consideration, and even global shocks that will appear from time to time. I mean, as you know, probably next week we'll be consulting with the international financial institutions to also get them on board. And as I would have said, and even my co-chair, we want to make sure that we have a truly universal MVI that is also applicable to other developing countries, even though the focus is or will be on small states, recognizing that they're the most vulnerable. And invariably, where you have an index that covers the vulnerability of small states, for the most part, if not almost exclusively, it will also be applicable to other developing countries. So again, I'll invite New Zealand to intervene, and then my distinguished co-chair will announce the next 3 interventions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister. And good morning, Excellencies, panelists, and to colleagues. Thank you very much for the update of this work. I wanted to take the floor to just express our real support for the work of the panel. New Zealand has been a long-standing supporter of an increased focus on vulnerability and recognition of vulnerabilities of SIDS in particular, and the need for this to be taken into account in our international action. I heard the pace of the work of the panel, and so I really do want to thank our co-chairs and the panelists for their commitment to this work. I see that it will be a lot, but I think the outcome is going to be something that's really useful. Just wanted to make a couple of comments on the work. I think from New Zealand's point of view, we are open to the potential applications of the MVI. You know, it'd be great to have recommendations from the panel on how this might be implemented, but I think as the MVI develops and begins to be used, I think there is a potential wide application.
Thomas, to Missy Blair.
And I really appreciate that the focus that was expressed on simplicity. I think for this to work, the MVI needs to be able to be practically applied and be comparable across. So thank you very much to the panel for that. I also wanted to support the comments that were made by the co-chairs on the importance of resilience and incorporation of resilience within the MVI. We acknowledge this is not easy, but I think if it can be done, it would be extremely useful when we're recognizing vulnerabilities and exposure to exogenous shocks. We also need to be looking at how we build resilience to overcome those. And just finally, I would like to acknowledge the need for consensus to be built around the MVI. I think the briefing here today was a great start, and I would encourage the panel to continue to update member states. And I had a question that Prime Minister, you already answered about how the panel will also engage with actors outside the UN. I think engagement with the IFIs in particular, really important. So fantastic to hear that that will be happening shortly. Again, that goes back to looking at the potential broader applications of the MVI. So just to close, I have to say thank you very much. New Zealand stands ready to support and looks forward to continued updates and the outcomes of the panel. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start by thanking New Zealand's representative for that intervention. And there is a clear interest for us also to have your statements submitted, if it's possible to do that on e-statements alphaun.org to be posted through the United Nations Journal is the question. There is nobody else who has asked for the floor. Can I say that we would wish you to use the chat box if somebody is requesting the floor. I'll wait to see if there are any more asking for the floor. Okay, the UK. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, co-chairs and your excellencies. Thank you for this valuable opportunity to learn more about the work of the high-level panel of experts on the MVI and to also offer a few reflections. At the outset, I would like to congratulate the co-chairs and panel members on their appointment. The UK is supportive of the mandate for a high-level panel to review the potential role of an MVI and set out conditions for a viable index. We're grateful for this opportunity to learn about the panel's progress as well. Ultimately, it is past time for the world to step up and support SIDS to build resilient and prosperous futures. We have all accepted, as has been reflected in today's discussion, that for decades, the special development situation of SIDS, we know that GNI per capita is a poor measurement of development for small states, yet too little has been done to respond to their unique vulnerabilities. From the UK perspective, ODA criteria should take into account the unique challenges of vulnerable small states. Furthermore, multilateral organizations should take heed of the Glasgow Climate Pact's call to consider vulnerability in decisions on eligibility and allocations of finance. Climate change means that time has run out on our broken approach. In this regard, I'd like to pose a question to the panel, which is, how will the panel ensure that there is widespread buy-in into its work and encourage political engagement with their findings over the coming months, particularly as these issues will require wide consensus for change? Thank you.
I'd like to thank the distinguished representative of the UK for asking one of the most difficult questions for us to answer this early in our work. Our ambition, of course, is to make sure that both international financial institutions will use the MVI as one aspect. We would also like the OECD to make sure that this is part of what is looked upon as when you are estimating governmental grants from donor countries, which of course UK is a participant in. So I can challenge you back. How can we get UK to make sure that together with Norway and other countries that we are working on the OECD committees to make sure that they are not the ones who are stopping the development. So I think we will have to do our best to work on the policy, make a very good MVI that can lead into the possibilities of the financial institutions using this as a tool in making sure that you can have concessional financing, which I think is the core issue of this. It will not be a success if you don't manage this, but I think we have a very good starting point with all the work that has been done from so many institutions. But I think one core element is, of course, to get the OECD countries to also engage into understanding that we have to have more than GDP and GNI as measurements of development for the future. I'm now going to see if any more has asked for the floor. Yes, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guyana.
Thank you very much, co-chairs, for this briefing. And Guyana agrees fully that the MVI is long overdue, given that we're 3 decades later since the SIDS countries were identified as a special case in sustainable development. I would like to ask a question. Given the universal nature of the MVI, which means that all countries really would be able to access the financing, how do we ensure that SIDS are not lower down this ladder? Given some of the simulations that we have seen in other indices. And Prime Minister Brown, you have mentioned that there will be consultation with the IFIs. And Guyana sees the IFIs as extremely critical to this process, because at the end of the day, it is about access to concessionary financing that we are designing the MVI to address. And what has been the, if I can say, the stumbling block in not getting the IFIs on board before now? Thank you.
Prime Minister Brown, would you like to answer this
Sure,
question?
sure. Thank you very much. Indeed. Well, we had not done the expert work before. I mean, certainly the work that we're doing now, will make a compelling case for the IFI and even donor countries, developed countries, to be more inclusive with their development assistance and concessional financing. What we're seeking to do here is to establish, yes, an inclusive framework, but at the same time with a special emphasis on SIDS. And it is that special emphasis on SIDS that would ensure inclusivity to include medium and high income SIDS. So it is very important work here to ensure that there's some priority given to SIDS. I mean, in the past, they were graduated and still remain very vulnerable and had difficulties recovering from the various shocks because of the structural problems. And I think the work that we're doing here will identify those structural problems and to ensure that they can get the necessary funding in order to build resilience. Again, not to create any form of dependency, but to build resilience so that they can recover quicker, so that they can normalize their economies quicker and to obviously achieve their SDGs. So I have no doubt, based on the work that we're doing here, that we should see some priority for SIDS going forward in terms of concessional funding. And of course, we will continue to have very robust and broad-based stakeholder consultations to get buy-in.
Then I think I'll call on Antigua and Barbuda on behalf of the OSIS for a follow-up question. You have to unmute.
Great. We just wanted to follow up with a question saying that you're not yet flooded by a number of requests, and Prime Minister Brown just made some reference to the question in his response to our colleague from Guyana. We note that you have been so far engaging a number of agencies, UNDP, CDB, Caribbean Development Bank, the RCs and so on, and their reports or their MVIs have been presented to you. The Interagency Task Force did some very interesting and very stellar work last year on debt and debt sustainability, pointing to SIDS and others. And we were wondering if the co-chairs, if you were considering hearing from the Interagency Task Force. The Secretary General, in his report, made reference to this task force report and their work. And we think it would be very useful to get information from them. So we are wondering if you had any plans to hear from them, and if so, how you plan to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll try to answer your concrete question, but maybe Prime Minister, would you like? Prime Minister Brown?
Sure. Thanks, Excellency. Ambassador, we obviously have to broaden the consultative mechanism to ensure that we get other agencies involved, including the IATF. The issue of debt that you mentioned, for example, is a critical issue to small states. It's easily one of the most significant structural problems affecting small states. I mean, many of them have had to borrow repeatedly to repair damaged infrastructure. And as a result, they have ended up with unsustainable debt. Now, if we had a framework in place prior to help them to build resilience, then evidently the need for borrowings would have been considerably reduced, and that structural problem would not have existed. But we have to acknowledge that there is a structural problem of debt, and that issue also must be given significant consideration in the development of the MVI, because if that issue is not resolved, then you're literally back to square one. Because we know that their high debt profile reduces the amount of funds available for recovery and even for development generally. So we do accept, yes, that we can invite the IATF to participate in future consultations and to have their input, and any other significant group that may have been omitted from the onset. Let us broaden these consultations and ensure that the consultations are inclusive, that they're robust, and to get buy-in from the various stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more who would like the floor? It doesn't seem like that. Then I think we will say this is a starting point for our discussions with the different member states. As I tried to say before I started all the coughing, we have done, and we've had 3 meetings. We have tried to work hard on learning about all of the reports, and I think that the report just mentioned from the Small Island States, the Alliance of Small Island States and Interagency Task Force, of course, is one of those we haven't heard yet, but we will look into it. And what we really need also is if there are any others who would give us example of work that we have not looked at so far, if there is any points that we should look thoroughly on. The determination on how these will be and can be considered will be decided on by the panel, but we hope to have an open process, and we will come back to all of you with new briefings on this. I think we have heard from the last speakers, not anybody else is going to ask for the floor. I'm not going to continue to try to entertain you this morning. I know it's morning for a lot of you, but Prime Minister Brown, do you have some closing remarks?
Sure. Thank you, Co-Chair. And I just want to join you in commending the various delegations for their interventions. And if there are individuals who have other ideas that they would wish to add, feel free to, send a message to the Secretariat so that we can give serious consideration to any new idea or any addition that you may have. And I just wish to add here too that, our next informal briefing will be held shortly, and we will announce a date. So keep informed as we keep these meetings very efficient and frequent as we seek to complete the report possibly by September, and perhaps to have the MVI operational by the end of the year. So again, thank you very much for the various interventions. And we have gotten some let's say a number of messages have been reinforced in terms of keeping the index simple to make sure it is truly functional index, and at the same time to ensure universality. And we also thank New Zealand, the UK, and the others who indicated their support for the work that has been done to date. And also, especially the UK, that would have emphasized the need for us to develop an index that could close that gap that doesn't exist in the other indices, including the per capita income criterion, a situation that has literally disenfranchised a number of SIDS for many decades. And I think we now have the opportunity to deal with that inequity and to have the matter resolved, and obviously to ensure that global financial flows are utilized in an equitable way, and at the same time to ensure that those flows do not exclude countries from much needed financing to build resilience. And again, to emphasize not dependency, but to build resilience, ensure sustaining recovery, and at the same time quick recovery whenever they are faced with these shocks that will occur from time to time. So once again, thank you very much, and we look forward to joining you at the next briefing. Thank you.
Should we just thank all the delegation for attending and active participation today? And I'll challenge the other OECD countries to also work on the MBI, not just those who are the most vulnerable ones, who can see the effect and need it, because we do need policy support if we are going to make this change happen. And I'd just like to say thank you to everybody and say that this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.